What makes a Nazi? How does he get that way? Nice going, eh, Adolf?
The year is 1939. While the war overseas has begun, back in the United States, a greater peace is being looked at for all Europe. So on December 9th of that year, MGM Studios releases Peace on Earth, just in time for Christmas. Set around the holiday, it delivers a clear anti-war message to theatergoers as they watch animals take over a post-apocalyptic world where humans have fought to the last man, and now the animals rule, who themselves rebuild society with the soldiers' helmets they find. Beloved by audiences across the nation who shared the same view of pacifism, the cartoon was nominated for the 1939 Academy Award for Short Subjects. It's important to note that this was the first cartoon ever created to touch base with a serious subject, done by a major studio. Though not necessarily a propaganda cartoon, it does lay the framework for the general theme of war in cartoons, as soon we would find more and more joining this theme as cartoons went to war. It didn't take long for the Germans to realize the propaganda power that cartoons possessed, releasing their own original creations during the early years of the war. Shorts like these were shown to teach lessons, like valuing the strong over the weak, and to be fearful of Jews. At the same time, the British were using them as well, but for a more practical purpose, like teaching pilots the dangers of oxygen prevention at high altitudes. It wasn't until after the attacks on Pearl Harbor that animators in the United States really stepped up their game. Clearly the most valuable of these was Walt Disney. On December 8, 1941, the day after the Japanese attacks, the US government started work with him on the creation of a variety of films, both to entertain youthful cadets as well as to inform them of proper procedures during war. Training videos as well as cartoons began spewing out of Disney Studios. One of the very first propaganda films to come out of this partnership was the 1941 short film Seven Dwarfs, which rode into theaters on the coattails of Snow White, which was released 2 years prior to the short, selling war bonds to people in both the United States and Canada. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, the Russians were releasing much darker, direct messages in their cartoons, like this one, entitled The Vultures. Back at Disney Studios, the animators were working constantly under the thumb of their largest client in history, with over 90% of its workforce producing both training and propaganda films for the government. The United States understood the value that Disney offered them as a means of keeping the morale of the country at its highest. So, because of this perceived value, Army personnel were stationed at its studios and lived there throughout the years of the war, with one officer's headquarters actually based out of Walt Disney's own office. In 1942 alone, aside from their major studio releases like Bambi, Disney released 5 Army-related films, one of which was Stop That Tank, an informational tool used to educate Allied soldiers on how to correctly use an anti-tank rifle. This was arranged because up until now, the anti-tank rifles had been viewed as a jinx among soldiers on the front line, and the Allied governments wanted to put a stop to those views. This would be the first of many educational films to be released by the studio during that period. The themes of the cartoons from this era usually remained very cut and dry. It was good versus evil, a moral war that anyone could get behind. Of course, Disney wasn't the only animation studio to do this. Warner Brothers brought Bugs Bunny and Friends to theaters across the nation in short films to sell bonds. MGM returned to the genre with their first war-themed cartoon since Peace on Earth, with a film entitled Blitzwolf, which was basically the Three Little Pigs story done to the extreme with a Nazi-orientated undertone for the wolf. Popeye, a transporter of supplies to Britain at that time, fought Nazis on the way, in Spinach for Britain.
Heil Hitler! Heil Hitler! Heil Hitler! Heil Hitler! Heil Hitler!
Porky Pig cracked down on Nazi spies.
Say, have you seen a spy around here?
Superman even joined the action, terrorizing Japanese naval yards and stopping American hijacked bombers. Though the characters and the villains were always different, the overall theme stayed the same. It was always know your enemy time at theaters across the nation during these war years. But not all were action-driven. There were those that offered a much more patriotic message, directed towards housewives, like that of Disney's Out of the Frying Pan and Into the Firing Line, featuring Minnie Mouse and Pluto, that compared a full skillet of grease to a miniature ammunition factory, and offered up imagery like giving a soldier that last bullet to survive, urging Americans to save their fats. Food will win the war stressed the importance of producing American agriculture, giving the American farmer a daily pride doing his job, knowing that now he was doing his part to help win the war. And the winged Scourge was made for enlisted men traveling to heavily populated mosquito areas, and with the help of the Seven Dwarfs, educated them on techniques to avoid malaria. These cartoons were meant for both the public and enlisted eyes, yet these weren't the only cartoons that were shown to soldiers at that time. Enlisted men during this time were treated to their own private cartoons, uncensored by Warner Brothers.
Snafu. Situation normal. All fouled up.
These cartoons for the most part were used to educate soldiers on the seriousness of Army regulations, like spilling military secrets on leave to spies, avoiding possible booby traps, and so forth.
What's up, Doc?
A vast majority of these cartoons were written by none other than Dr. Seuss himself, which becomes quite obvious.
Now, the military secret that I carry in my brain, I keep in safe deposit with a padlock and chain.
Some of the animators that worked on these films for Warner Brothers may have been drafted or enlisted, but stayed put in their normal animating job, drawing for their country under a branch of the service. Back in the public eye, a wartime cartoon showdown between two major animation powerhouses was underway. While the powers across the world decided how to make their birds fly higher and faster, Disney and Warner Brothers were in a battle for the best duck to represent America during the war. So a showdown was on between Donald Duck for Disney and Daffy Duck for Warner, as both characters at this time were respectively sent off to fight for their country in their own cartoons. It's still unclear why Disney didn't select Mickey to be the mascot going off to war, although it may have had something to do with Hitler being a big Mickey Mouse fan. Nevertheless, Donald's wartime adventure was quite a story, going as far as starting him with being drafted into the army.
Sign here.
Yes, sir.
Covering him from that day throughout boot camp all the way up to his first mission against the Japanese.
Now you're cautioned to be on the alert for snipers and man-eating crocodiles.
In a series of 5 separate cartoons. Daffy's story, however, started differently, beginning as a superhero on American soil, defending it from Nazis after he upset Adolf with his unusually large scrap pile.
Destroy that scrap pile! Destroy that scrap pile! Destroy that scrap pile! Destroy that scrap pile!
Which at the time sent out a very positive message to Americans watching, who themselves were having scrap drives to save and reuse vital materials of all kinds, allowing more soldiers to leave the mines and factories to join the war effort. So it's understandable why this pile might have upset Hitler. It wasn't until later that Daffy actually entered Germany, battling troops on the front lines and even making an encounter with Hitler himself along the way. It wasn't until 1945's Drafty Daffy that Daffy got drafted. One can only wonder why Warner would even do a short about Daffy being drafted after his previous encounters in the war, and not let this story go to some other character in the lineup, screwing up the timeline of the character, and disassociating his story with audiences. Keeping with the theme of ducks, Hitler himself even took on the form of a duck in The Ductators, a 1942 Warner Brothers film about an evil duck who emerges from a black egg, and soon after forms a military force unmatched by any others down on the farm in Germany. Guest starring Mussolini, along with Emperor Hirohito as well.
1, 2, button
crush you. 3, 4, shut honorable door. 5, 6, see him over the sticks.
Now, Disney at this time didn't want to be outdone by Warner Brothers. So, to date, they made one of their boldest decisions yet, sending Donald Duck off to Germany, making him into a full-fledged Nazi. For this, Disney was praised by critics for Duffy's face, which Donald is sent off to the fatherland to experience life without freedom as a typical German worker, only to wake up and find out he's still an American. The film won over the hearts of audiences, and even won a 1942 Academy Award for animated short films, and to date is considered one of his best of all his 150 theatrical cartoon releases. Back in Germany, not to be outdone by the quality of products that were hitting theaters in the United States, the Nazis took to a small French animation studio in Vichy to produce a cartoon entitled Nimbus Libre, which in translation is Dark Cloud Released. In this film, Felix the Cat, Popeye, Goofy, Mickey Mouse, and Donald Duck fly together above occupied France as families below listen in to a radio broadcaster telling them that the Allies are coming to liberate them from the Nazis. Meanwhile, the characters in the skies above are too preoccupied with their own agendas, as well as bad animation, to realize that they are thus bombing the small families home and killing them. Though the film might be viewed as highly irrelevant, back then it was a big morale killer among occupied Europe, as even remote farmers might begin to fear the Allies rather than welcome their coming. Once again, the German propaganda machine had done its job, using America's own heroes against them. Back in America, the gloves were off, and cartoon studios began to join together to help send Adolf Hitler straight to hell. The last cartoon from this era, and probably best known, was Hair Meets Hair, released shortly before the conclusion of the war, featuring Bugs Bunny, Hermann Goering, and Hitler. Interestingly enough, cartoons like this were shown to German POWs back in America at the time, though the Germans weren't at all amused. Reactions ranged, but one thing was clear. The POWs hated Bugs Bunny for what he did to Goering, ripping him of his decorations. Many of the POWs said that it showed tremendous disrespect for Hitler's second-in-command. And that's the point. Why else would Joseph Goebbels go to so much trouble to make these characters look bad in his own film? These shorts paved the way for generations of cartoons to come. They broke down censors' walls well before their time. Guns, bombs, tanks, political humor, and even death. If it wasn't for their involvement in the Second World War, who knows what cartoons would even look like today? Certainly the war added a spark of creativity to animation studios across the nation, and even though in many cases it was fueled by a hate for their enemy, it spurred many great moments.
Hitler is a stinker!
Studios involved in this generation of animation have since closed their door to the current network's rebroadcasting of these classic cartoons, rejecting some wartime creations, certainly because of their racial undertones for the most part.
Hello, please. Master shooting the rope right in the center of the middle, just like the Lone Ranger. I did it!
But others just because we were making fun of Nazis at this time. But as we can see from the German propaganda films, these cartoons certainly got under their skin, and that's something that we as Americans should be proud of. Because if you're not going to fight Nazis, if you can't justify that in today's society, then what on TV can you justify?